Biography of Sheikh Al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah. Was he suffering from the ruling political system? His qualities and morals since the emergence of the Islamic message and its spread in the world. Part 10. We continue to narrate a stage in the life of Sheikh Al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah responds that such speech is no longer God's own because it does not subsist within him. For Ibn Taymiyyah, the correct view, the view of the Salaf, is that God has been speaking by his will and power from eternity with individual acts of speech subsisting in his essence. These divine speech acts are not themselves eternal, but neither are they created because created things do not subsist in the essence of God. Ibn Taymiyyah breaks the kalam identity of the temporal with the created and the timelessly eternal with the uncreated. God's internal dynamism is temporal in character but not created. God's uncreated speech acts are temporal and can address temporal events in the world. Creation in Ibn Taymiyyah's theology is a voluntary attribute like speech. God's perfection entails that God perpetually created things by his will and power from eternity without beginning, min al-azal. While each created thing in the world had a beginning and no created thing is eternal alongside God, there has always been one created thing or another. This present world that God created in 6 days was created out of prior materials that God had created previously out of prior created things and so on ad infinitum into the past. Ibn Taymiyyah speaks of the genus or species of created things being eternal since there have always been created things, but he denies that this genus as such has an extramental existence. In a history of creation that has no beginning and no end, only created things with beginnings exist in extramental reality. Ibn Taymiyyah's view of creation is closer to the philosophers Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd than to the Kalam theologians. He follows both philosophers in affirming that God's perfection entails the production of the world, but like Ibn Rushd, he rejects Ibn Sina's emanation scheme in favor of God's continuous creation of the world. Ibn Taymiyyah may well have been inspired by Ibn Rushd since we know that he read the philosopher's texts. Ibn Taymiyyah also adopts Ibn Sina's and Ibn Rushd's criticism of the Kalam theologians' account of creation ex nihilo. If the world had had a beginning, as the Kalam theologians argue, God would have been imperfect before creating it and subject to change when he began the creation process. A preponderator, miraji, or efficient cause would need to have arisen to cause God to start originating. The Kalam theologians counter that it was in the very nature of God's will to begin originating the world, and no additional preponderator was needed to cause God to begin creating. Ibn Taymiyyah rejects this as positing something impossible, namely, preponderance without a preponderator. Ibn Taymiyyah affirms that God's activity is rational. God creates on account of a cause, illah, or wise purpose, hikmah, and, given that God has been creating from eternity, the wise purposes of God's creative acts regress infinitely into the past within God's essence. Moreover, God's rationality is not purely altruistic. God acts for benefits that redound not only to creatures but also to God himself. For Ibn Taymiyyah, it is neither rational nor praiseworthy for agents to commit acts that are of no benefit to themselves. Ash'ari theologians object that a God who acts for wise purposes must be needy and dependent on those acts to attain perfection. Ibn Taymiyyah counters that it is rational for agents to be perfected by their acts and that it is a greater perfection to create things for wise purposes at the right times than to create without purpose. God is self-sufficient, not in the sense of being free to act or not act without reason, the Ash'ari view, but in needing no help in the act of creation. Furthermore, God's love for the love and obedience of his servants does not derive from God's need for love. Rather, it follows on from God's love of God's self. God's self-love is primary, and from God's self-love flows God's love for human beings and the creation of everything that they do, including their love for God and obedience to him. God does not act to acquire perfection. Instead, God's creative acts, and with them the created world, are necessary concomitants of the perfection of God's essence. Ibn Taymiyyah's resolution to the problem of God's self-sufficiency is Neoplatonic, and the notion of God's self-love giving rise to the world as a necessary concomitant is found in the Neoplatonism of Ibn Taymiyyah uses the language of secondary causes, s.g. sabab, in instrumental and material senses to describe the process of God's creation of things in the world. For example, God creates the human act by means of the human will and power. God makes plants grow by means of clouds and rain, and God causes illness and death by means of poison. In general, God creates everything out of and by means of previously existing materials and powers. Secondary causality looks natural from the human perspective, even though God has the power to interrupt it, but from the divine perspective, it is purely instrumental. God's creation of all human acts raises the question of human responsibility. The Mutazili Kalam theologians maintain that humans are responsible for their acts because humans themselves create them. Ibn Taymiyyah rejects the Mutazili formulation as compromising God's exclusive creative power. Instead, in what may be earlier texts, he affirms that humans are the agents of their acts and therefore liable to reward and punishment because God creates their acts in them and not in himself. In what may be later texts, Ibn Taymiyyah also roots the origin of human moral failure in non-existence to absolve God completely of creating it. Humans are liable to punishment for omitting to do the deeds that they were created to perform. This omission is a privation. It does not exist, and so it cannot be attributed to God. As with Ibn Taymiyyah's approach to God's self-sufficiency, Avicenna and Neoplatonic inclinations color his theodicy as well. God creates all things, including evils, for wise purposes that are ultimately good. Pure or absolute evil does not exist. Evil is only evil relative to those afflicted by it. Ibn Taymiyyah sometimes says that God's wise purposes in evil cannot be known. At other times, however, he indicates that God's wise purposes have to do with nurturing religious virtues such as repentance, humility, and patience. Ibn Taymiyyah ultimately affirms that everything God creates is good and that this world is the best of all possible worlds. To avoid the charge that this limits God's power, Ibn Taymiyyah asserts that God could create other than this world. However, God creates the world that he does out of his perfection and wise purpose. Ibn Taymiyyah's theory of religion, din, is decidedly naturalistic and sociological, at least in its foundations, and, as will be noted further below, it draws on Ibn Sina's analysis of final causality to point to God as religion's proper object of worship. For Ibn Taymiyyah, humans are dynamic and goal-oriented beings who necessarily will, love, worship, and obey something. So, they cannot help but be religious. Moreover, human beings are social, and every human group requires a religion to unite it and guide it in attaining benefit and warding off harm. Religion consists of inner and outer acts of obedience, worship, and ethical character, and it is what people love in common to attain mutual benefit. Religion then has two fundamental aspects: 1. The object of love and worship, and 2. The means by which that object is loved and worshipped. The divinely revealed and most beneficial religion is worship and love of God alone by means of the prescriptions of Islam. Ibn Taymiyyah elaborates as follows: every living being must have an object of love, which is the goal of its love and its will and towards which its inner and outer movements are directed. That is its God. That love, will, and movement is of no benefit unless it is for God alone, without giving him an associate. Everything other than Islam is worthless. Every religion, obedience, and love must have two things. The first is the object of religion, love, and obedience. This is the object of intention and the object of will. The second is the form of the deeds by which that object is obeyed and worshipped. This is the way, the path, the law, the method, and the means of access. Religion encompasses two things: the object of worship and the worship. The object of worship is the one God. Worship is obeying him and obeying his messenger. This is the religion of God with which he is well pleased. As he said, "I am well pleased with Islam as a religion for you." Quran 5-3. Ibn Taymiyyah frequently signifies God's unique worthiness of worship with the terms uluhiyya and ilahiyya. Both mean divinity. in the sense of that which is worshipped, and he compounds them with the term tawhid, confessing the oneness or exclusivity of God, to denote the act of taking God as the sole object of worship and obedience. Tawhid al-Uluhiyya and Tawhid al-Ilahiyya. Ibn Taymiyyah also uses the terms Rububiyyah and Rabbaniyya, lordship, to denote God's role as creator, sustainer, and source. The confession that God is the one and only Lord of the universe, Tawhid al-Rububiyyah or Tawhid al-Rabbaniyya, means that God is creator of everything that exists, all human acts included. Ibn Taymiyyah often complains that the Ash'ari Kalam theologians give primacy to confessing the exclusiveness of God's lordship, Tawhid al-Rububiyyah, and lose sight of God's sole right to worship. Instead, he argues, the Quran gives priority to devoting worship to God alone, Tawhid al-Uluhiyya, as in the invocation in the first chapter of the Quran, you alone we worship, you alone we ask for help, Quran 1-5. You alone we worship comes first as an expression of Tawhid al-Uluhiyya and is then followed by, you alone we ask for help, as a confession that God is the sole source of sustenance, an expression of Tawhid al-Rububiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah further elucidates the priority of God's worthiness of worship with the Aristotelian causal analysis of Ibn Sina. For Ibn Sina, the final cause is the end for which something comes into existence, and the efficient cause is that which brings the thing into existence. Additionally, the final cause is the efficient cause of the efficient cause insofar as it motivates the action of the efficient cause. In the following discussion of Quran 1-5, Ibn Taymiyyah links final causality to divinity and efficient causality to lordship and underlines the primacy of divinity by identifying it as the efficient cause of the efficient cause lordship. The God, Al-Ilah, is the one worshipped and asking for help is linked to his lordship. The Lord of the servants is he who lords over them. This entails that he is creator of everything that is in them and from them. The divinity is the final cause, and lordship is the efficient cause. The final cause is that which is aimed at, and it is the efficient cause of the efficient cause. Therefore, he made, you alone we worship, proceed, you alone we ask for help. Confessing the exclusiveness of the divinity, Tawhid al-Ilahiyya, includes confessing the exclusiveness of the lordship, Tawhid al-Rububiyyah. Included in worshipping only God is not confessing the lordship of any other. This law encompasses everything that God loves for human beings to believe and do, and it includes religious ritual, theological doctrines, contractual and moral obligations toward others, and religious virtues like patience and gratitude. Ibn Taymiyyah maintains as well that the law of Islam is coextensive with justice and maximum human benefit, maslaha, in much the same way that he claims that reason and revelation coincide in matters of theology. Ibn Taymiyyah is as much an apologist for the rationality of the divine law as he is for the rationality of his theological doctrines. The two terms, law and justice, are for him interchangeable, and he goes so far as to say that God will give victory to a just state that is not Muslim over a Muslim state that is not just. Furthermore, there is nothing outside the revealed law whose benefit outweighs its detriment. In Ibn Taymiyyah's view, the means of worship most pleasing to God and most beneficial to humankind is the law, Sharia, revealed to the Prophet Muhammad. The religious law never neglects a benefit, and Muslim jurists who imagine that some acts not mentioned in the law are beneficial are mistaken. Al-Ghazali had developed a process for authorizing unstated benefits, al-Masala al-Mursala, by identifying 5 fundamental purposes of the law: the preservation of religion, intellect, life, progeny, and property. Benefits not found directly in the revealed law may be legitimized as part of that law by aligning them with the main purposes of the law. Ibn Taymiyyah criticizes this strategy for adding rulings to the law that God did not legislate. Additionally, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, Al-Ghazali's 5 purposes are too narrowly focused on worldly affairs, and they do not take sufficient account of benefits found in legislated worship rituals like the ritual prayer, salah. For Ibn Taymiyyah, innovated religious rituals, like commemorating the Prophet's birthday, and other acts not found within the law may yield some benefit for those who perform them, but the detriments always outweigh the benefits. Ibn Taymiyyah therefore condemns such acts and urges abandoning them if possible. Religion for Ibn Taymiyyah cannot do without temporal power, and he criticizes two errors in this regard. One is avoiding power and wealth so as not to sully religion with the compromises of temporal affairs, and the other is deploying power and wealth for personal gain instead of advancing religion. To avert these errors, Ibn Taymiyyah seeks to infuse public authority with the ethical impulses of the revealed law in his book Law-Guided Public Policy, Al-Siyasa al-Sharia. The purpose of the public authorities, whether they be political, military, judicial or scholarly, is to reform the religion of the people, in order that religion is entirely for God and that the word of God is most high. Siyasa 30:3-3. Rulers are to further the cause of religion and enable worship of God alone within whatever political structures happen to be in place. While Ibn Taymiyyah speaks to the appointment of public officials, the distribution of public wealth, the conduct of war, the provision of public services, and criminal and personal status law among other things, he does not outline a blueprint for a perfect Islamic state. He instead exhorts public officials to work toward religious reform to the best of their abilities within the circumstances, using force as deemed prudent. It has been observed that Ibn Taymiyyah's ethics of God's creative and commanding activity follows the utilitarian maxim of the greatest happiness for the greatest number. This is readily apparent in Ibn Taymiyyah's theodicy. God continuously produces the greatest possible benefit for the greatest number by creating the best of all possible worlds. Ibn Taymiyyah's metaethical theory on the human plane mirrors this divine utilitarianism. He rejects the moral rationalism of the Mutazili Kalam theologians who argue that acts are objectively good or bad in themselves such that God commands an act because it is good or forbids an act because it is bad. He also rebuffs classical Ash'ari divine command theory in which the moral values of acts are determined solely by God's will such that an act is good only because God commands it. Ibn Taymiyyah instead follows the consequentialist inclinations of post-classical Ash'aris like Fakhr al-Din al-Razi. The moral values of acts depend on the outcomes of those acts, whether they produce pleasure or pain, benefit or detriment, profit or harm. The goodness of an act depends on the degree to which it is advantageous to the actor or wider society, and rational human communities should seek to maximize their overall benefit. The role of God's law then is to point humankind to what is of ultimate benefit in both this life and the hereafter, namely, worshipping God alone according to God's law. For example, Islamic law forbids eating carrion, but Ibn Taymiyyah permits eating it if necessary to avoid starvation. More generally, Ibn Taymiyyah maintains the revealed law as his guiding ideal, but he insists that the benefits and detriments of actions must be weighed up carefully when human weakness or sin make following the law difficult or impossible or when the law is not fully known. His reflection on the caliphate is a poignant example of such utilitarian calculation. Like other post-classical Muslim jurists, Ibn Taymiyyah sometimes overrides explicit legal prohibitions on the grounds of benefit and necessity. Ibn Taymiyyah maintains that the caliphate of prophecy, the normative caliphate of the first four Sunni caliphs following the death of the Prophet Muhammad, is an obligation for the Muslim community. Morally inferior kingship, which predominated in Muslim lands after the first four Sunni caliphs, is only permissible in case of need. Nonetheless, Ibn Taymiyyah maintains, kingship is only a minor sin, and Muslims should weigh up the benefits and detriments in the circumstances to attain the greatest possible benefit for religion. It might be beneficial, for example, to indulge a king's wine drinking if calling upon him to stop would lead to the greater detriment of his apostasy from Islam. Moreover, Ibn Taymiyyah explains, such weighing up of benefits and detriments is the way of the Prophet. I stop at this point today. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep exploring the world's incredible stories. Thank you for watching.